What's up, guys? So I just pulled this really old chess endgame book off my shelf, and when I say really old, it's older than me, it's older than my parents. I think it was copyright in like 1941. It's called Basic Chess Endings by Reuben Fine. I don't know if you can see that on the camera there, but it's like been taped together. It's literally falling apart at the seams. It's a long book. It's got 573 pages, and at the very end, on the very last page, it has conclusion and summary, and it says 15 rules for the endgame. And I thought that would be a really nice video to just go through these 15 rules, talk about them. So I hope you're ready to learn some endgame principles because we're going to start right now. All right, so rule number one is doubled, isolated, and blockaded pawns are weak. Avoid them. So I think doubled, isolated, I think we know what those are. When it says blockaded pawns, I'm assuming that that means a backward pawn. So in this position right here, this guy on b3 is a backward pawn because the pawns on the adjacent side of it can no longer support it. They can't protect it and they can't help it move forward. And because it's blockaded like this, it's called a backward pawn and it's a weakness. And then over here, we have what's called an isolated pawn. No pawns are on the adjacent file that can support it. And these are considered doubled and isolated as well. These are probably the worst of the bunch because not only are they weak and can't be supported, this guy can't even move because it's blocked by your own pawn. It's just a real mess. Now, if you count up the material in this position, we've got a rook, we've got a knight, we've got a bishop, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right, so it's even. But if you want to take a guess, what do you think Stockfish says is the evaluation of this position? Well, if you had a chance to think about that, the answer is minus 1.1. Okay, that means black is basically ahead a pawn, 1 pawn and 1/10 of a pawn, 1.1. How is that the case? Well, it's not because they're actually up a pawn, right? We already counted there's 5 pawns against 5 pawns. It has to do with the fact that black has a lot of small little things that when you put them all together, it actually adds up to a significant advantage. So what are the things that black has going for them? Number one, the king is more active than this king. We'll come back to that in another rule later, but the king is closer to the center of the board, has lots of options on where it wants to go. White's king is kind of stuck over here. A knight against bishop. Generally speaking, bishops are a little bit better. Backward pawn. The rook here and the pawn are blockading this. This is a weakness that white has to defend. And then we already talked about these as well. Double isolated pawns. Isolated pawn, and look at black's nice pawn structure over here. So the key takeaway from this is that it's not always about the material necessarily. Sometimes it's about other things that can add up to a big advantage as well. All right, on to rule number two. Passed pawns should be advanced as rapidly as possible. So this one, I was kind of surprised to hear, although it does make sense, but there's a word of caution here. So here's a position, it's white to play, and according to the rule, passed pawns, which would be this one, should be advanced as rapidly as possible. That means you should start pushing it down the board, right? There's one caveat to that, and the catch is you have to be careful you don't push it too fast to where it just gets captured. So for example, if we were to play h4, king goes here, and we play h5, we're just giving away the pawn for free. Black's just going to go there and take it, right? And it turns out we can actually still win the game doing that, but you do have to be careful. And so what I would recommend in this position is using the king to support the pawn and pushing it with the help of the king. So for example, something like king e3, king here, and I don't know what black's going to do, but once you get your king over here, now you can start pushing it and you can use it as a decoy, right? So for example, let's just say black does this, we play h4, black pushes here, we maybe trade, and I don't know what black's going to do, check, let's say here, and eventually at a good moment, we're going to abandon it, run back to the other side of the board and take all the other pawns, right? Because black can never leave. They can't go over here. We're going to just get a queen, right? So they have to stay in front of the pawn. And now it seems like a good time. We sacrifice the pawn and we end up winning because we actually just get all the rest of the pawns, right? So, definitely if you have passed pawns, you do want to be thinking about pushing them. I would just say be careful that you don't just give them away for free. And especially if there are other pieces on the board, you have to think through that a little bit more. But as a general rule, be looking to push your passed pawns because it ties down your opponent's pieces, having to guard them, which is going to open up opportunities on the other side of the board. All right, rule number 3. If you are 1 or 2 pawns ahead, exchange pieces but not pawns. Let me read that one more time. If you are 1 or 2 pawns ahead, exchange pieces but not pawns. All right, so here's the example position, and we do fit the bill. We are 1 pawn ahead in this example, right? We got 2 against 2 over here, and we have 3 against 2 here. So we're ahead 1 pawn, and the rule says to exchange pieces, but not pawns. So let me illustrate what happens, and of course you have to play the game, but let's just imagine for a second that we were to trade these bishops and we were to trade these knights, okay? So we exchanged pieces, but not pawns. What did this do for us? Well, now we can use our pawn majority over here, start pushing these guys somehow, and eventually we're going to get something like this where we can create a passed pawn. And once that happens, the only thing black can do is run their king over to babysit that pawn, right? Stop it from becoming a queen. And that's going to leave these guys vulnerable, and our king can come up. We can take those, kind of like we saw in the last game, right? You use that passed pawn as a decoy, right? Now, pretty straightforward. Now let's go back. I don't actually remember the exact position, but I think I had something like bishops here, knights here. And the rule says to exchange pieces, which I just showed you what happens, but not pawns, right? So let's take the same position, and now we're going to exchange all the pawns. So these two for these two for these two, okay? And we're left with a position like this. Now I want you to imagine that black says, you know what? I'm going to just bring my bishop here. I don't know, we did some random move, and they're going to take our pawn, okay? It's very easy for black to do that. They had a knight, they had a bishop, they could have sacrificed either of those pieces for our remaining pawn, and we're not going to be able to win this game anymore. It's really difficult to checkmate with a knight and a bishop without anything guarding black's king, but you give them a knight, it's too much. We're not going to be able to win unless they blunder the knight somehow, right? So this kind of shows you why you don't want to trade off all the pawns, because you trade off all the pawns, you can't win, right? But if we go back to the other position where the pieces were gone, all we had to do was push our pawns, get a passed pawn, and we won, right? So trade pieces, but not pawns when you are ahead by at least 1 or 2 pawns. All right, rule number 4 is actually very similar. It's kind of the opposite of rule number 3, but it says if you are 1 or 2 pawns behind, then exchange pawns, but not pieces. So I've taken the same exact position that I just showed you, but I flipped it to where now we're looking at it from black's perspective. So now we're behind, right? We're the one that only has 2 against the 3. So what are we supposed to do according to this rule? Exchange pawns, but not pieces, right? And it's for the same reason. If we can exchange all the pawns, these guys go away, these guys go away, and we have some pieces left. Sorry, these would be gone too. We have some pieces left. All we have to do now is sacrifice one of these for this pawn, and it's an easy draw, right? So that's the game plan when you're behind 1 or 2 pawns. And then obviously the other rule we just looked at was the reverse if you're ahead. All right, number 5. If you have an advantage, do not leave all the pawns on one side. So I think what they're trying to say in this one is that if you're ahead, like in this position, we're ahead a pawn, do not leave all the pawns on one side, meaning it's good to have pawns on both sides of the board. You don't want to have just pawns only on, this side of the board and none on the other side. So like if somehow black offered a trade and you were to trade all these pawns off, and then you would have 3 against 2 over here, that's not what you want, right? You want to leave some pawns on the other side as well. And if you think about it, when we were creating this passed pawn, black's king was going to have to, be running over here, let's just say. And to stop it, we want to be able to use our king now to come up here. And when black goes for here, we want to be going for these pawns, right? So something like this. This is how we're going to be able to win. We're going to take these and get a queen, hopefully before black does. Now we have to kind of calculate, make sure that works. I think we would win this, but that's kind of the idea. If there's no pawns over here, it's going to be easier for black to potentially get a draw. Okay, so when you have an advantage, try to make sure that there are some pawns on both sides of the board. All right, rule number 6, and this is the one that was on the thumbnail, and this one actually was surprising to me. Like, I knew the idea of this one, but I didn't realize that the statistics were as high as they were. So it says if you are 1 pawn ahead, in 99 cases out of 100, the game is drawn if there are pawns on only one side of the board. So here's an example position. There are pawns on only one side of the board, right? There's no pawns over here. And basically what it's saying is 99% of the time, this game is going to be a draw. And if you imagine, if we try to push these pawns forward and 2 of them get traded for 2 of them, all black has to do is sacrifice the knight for the pawn and it's just a draw, right? Now, the interesting thing is initially I was going to use this position as the example. But then Stockfish actually is saying that white can actually win this. And so this is kind of the exception. You're going to have better winning chances if it's a king and pawn in a game than if there are other pieces on the board. And you'd have to get some sort of Zugzwang position to win this. And so Stockfish is saying king f4, king f6. Let's see what it wants us to do. King e4. And let's just see f4. It says king d4. Looks like there's some tricky way to get around. Let's see what it's going to come up with. f5. Yeah, and now it's seeing, let's see, takes, and I guess you can force a win by pushing this pawn forward, f6, yeah, something like this. So there are cases, I think that 99 out of 100 rule is when like there are other pieces on the board, right? Like this one. This is when it's pretty much always going to be a draw if there's only one side of the board has pawns, right? Now, if there are pawns over here, you can imagine how it changes things. Now, white could potentially use their king to run over here or use the bishop to help. It gets a lot more interesting, and white has more chances. When it's just one side of the board, your opponent can just bring the pieces over there, get ready to sacrifice when they need to, and it's a draw, right? So keep that in mind when you're playing earlier in the game before you get to the end game. Maybe there were some pawns over here, and you could have left them on the board and you said, no, I'll just trade them off. Why not? Well, now you know a reason to leave them on would be if you're ahead, you'll give yourself more winning chances by leaving those pawns on the board. And if you're behind, keep this in mind to like try to trade off as many pawns as you can on one side of the board, because if you do get something like this, you're going to have better chances to get a draw. Okay, so that's the key takeaway there. Okay, number 7 actually ties in with what I just talked about, but the easiest endings to win are pure pawn endings. So if you imagine this position right here, it's pretty tough, right? But then when I switched it over and showed you, back here where the pieces were gone, white actually did have better chances to win. You had to just kind of do some maneuvering with your king, push the pawn at the right time, and you were able to pull it off. So this is going to be much more drawish. This is going to have, you're going to have better chances to win with your extra pawn. Right, number 8 is the easiest endings to draw are those with bishops of opposite colors. So when it says opposite color bishops, it's not talking about this is a white bishop and this is a black bishop. It's talking about this is a bishop along the that's on the dark squares, and this is a bishop that's on the light squares, right? So these two bishops can never attack each other. They can never threaten the square that the other one's on, right? And so because of that, it's extremely easy for black to get a draw. Just pushing the pawn like this, and it doesn't really matter what white is going to do. Black can simply create a blockade like this, right? Put their bishop there and just move the bishop back and forth, and white can't do anything. You can never really make progress because you can't attack any of these squares because your bishop's on the wrong color. So those are extremely drawish. So yeah, keep that in mind. Right, number 9 is the king is a strong piece. Use it. So we've talked about this before on the channel here. The active king in the endgame is extremely powerful. So this is a position where it's better for black because black has 6 pawns against white's 5, and black's eventually going to be able to create a pass pawn here and probably win. But because of white's active king placement, and look at black's king in the corner, this is not going to be an easy game for black to win. Black's going to have to be very careful because white has the option to come over here and stop this, the option to come over here, and if they can push their pawns, maybe you can make a break for it and try to, get a queen here. White has a lot of options because they're using their king. And so you want to be very careful if your king is stuck in the corner like this at the end of the game. Usually you want to try to bring it to the center or as close to the center as you can, as quickly as you can, because that's where it's going to be most effective. That's where you're going to have the most options to go to, whatever side of the board you need to go to. Right, number 10 is do not place your pawns on the color of your bishop. So this one, there are definitely exceptions to this one, but as a general rule, it's a good idea to keep in mind. So here we are, we have a bishop that's on the light squares, and we've got all of our pawns on the dark squares. And you can see how they really work together nicely. The bishop, controls these squares, the pawns control all of these squares, and you get this really nice sort of line where everything is kind of covered. And it does a nice job of preventing the knight, preventing the king from coming in. There's nowhere for the king to infiltrate because of the way you have this set up. If you start, let's say you push this, and I don't know, black does something, and then you push this, black does something, you push this, and all of a sudden, look at how black's king can pretty much infiltrate however they want, right? Like this, the knight can find, land on some of these squares, and your bishop and pawns are kind of doing the same thing. Your pawns are covering the squares that your bishop would be covering anyway, so you don't really need your pawns there. So it made sense, going back to the original position, to have some sort of setup like this. And now everybody is kind of doing a job. Nobody's doing the same thing and wasting board control, basically, right? So that's kind of the idea behind the general rule. And that being said, sometimes it does make sense. Like, let's say well, that's a blunder, but just for sake of example, sometimes you might need to put a pawn to defend your bishop, right? So occasionally you want to break that rule, but as a general guideline, pawns should go on the opposite color of your bishop. Number 11, bishops are better than knights in all except blocked pawn positions. And so here's a good example. This is not a blocked pawn position. This is a relatively open position, and we can just see how the bishop is really limiting what the knight can do, right? So that's one reason why bishops are better. Another reason is the bishop is monitoring both sides of the board. The knight, not really so much. I mean, a little bit, but really, to be effective, the knight's going to have to make a decision. Am I going to go this way and try to do some stuff on the queen side? Am I going to go this way and try to do some stuff on the king side? Whereas the bishop can say, I'm just going to sit here in the middle and I might go either way, right? The other thing, bishops have the ability to lose a tempo. It's a little bit more advanced for the scope of this video, but if you need to, in some certain situations, waste a move, it's very easy to drop back with your bishop or drop back 2 squares or whatever, and then go back to where you were and you can waste a move. Knights cannot waste moves because they switch colors every time they move. You just can't waste a tempo with a knight. That's one of the drawbacks of a knight. So you put all those little things together, bishops are slightly better, unless, okay, the exception was unless it's a locked position, which this is not. But if all the pawns got locked up somehow, that would be a different story. All right, number 12, 2 bishops versus a bishop and a knight constitute a tangible advantage. So this one I was actually curious about. I wanted to see like how big the advantage was. So I just set up this random position, tried to make it as equal as I could, except gave white the 2 bishops and black just has 1 bishop. And Stockfish says it's plus 0.5. So it's basically saying it's half of a pawn of an advantage for white. So I thought that was pretty interesting, which I guess you could say that's a tangible advantage. It's not a ton, but it is something. And the bishop pair is actually very, very good because you can control the entire board with your bishops. If one of these gets traded, then it's easy kind of for your opponent to blockade along the other colored square. So anyway, I guess keep that in mind. I think in practice, my experience has been it's not easy to make the most of the bishop pair. But if, in the right hands, it can be, and it is a slight advantage if you can have the bishop pair against like a bishop and a knight, or against 2 knights would be even better for the bishops. All right, number 13 was a little bit of an interesting one. It said passed pawns should be blockaded by the king. The only piece which is not harmed by watching a pawn is the knight. So it's kind of like 2 different principles in one, and they're both a little bit unrelated. It seemed like it's because it says, okay, blockade the pawns with your king, but then it says knights guarding the pawns are not the one, are still effective, basically. So I'm not exactly sure what that means. I've heard that knights are good defenders or good blockaders of passed pawns. So like in this example, if you put the knight there, the knight is going to be effective because it can jump over pieces. It doesn't matter like how many pawns or whatever kind of in front of it, it's still going to be effective. Now, oh, right. In this position, that's actually a big blunder. And if you'd like to pause, this is kind of a good bonus puzzle for you. Why is this a huge blunder that loses the game immediately? Well, if you had a chance to look at that, I didn't even notice this. I'm just using Stockfish over here, so that's why I saw it right away. But Stockfish told me bishop takes b5, and guess what? This guy is not going to be caught. a6, the king is obviously too far. You can try to bring the knight back, but it's a little too late, and white just gets a queen. So nice little tactic there. And so in this example, this was a bad example by on my part. The knight has to stay here because it needs to be a little bit closer to guard this in case white sacrifices the bishop. So you kind of have to leave your king. But anyway, I think the takeaway from this is that the king or the knight can potentially be good blockaders of passed pawns. Generally speaking, rooks are very ineffective because they're blocked by the pawn, and a lot of times bishops are okay. They're not maybe the greatest. And then queens, usually queens can be more effective somewhere else. And so that kind of leaves the king and the knight as the pieces that probably you should be using to blockade passed pawns. All right, number 14 is a rook on the 7th rank is sufficient compensation for a pawn. So the 7th rank would be here if you're white, or in this case, black has it on the 2nd rank, right? The rook on the 2nd rank. And basically what it's saying is this should be equal to a pawn. So I was curious, I put this into Stockfish, and sure enough, Stockfish says it's plus 0.2. So it's almost equal. It's saying slightly better for white, but even though white has an extra pawn, it's not really giving +1 for white. And it has to do with the fact that white's king is cut off. And so if you imagine if we try to make progress here, well, this rook can just, I don't know, rook to c2, and we try to make progress. Well, we're losing our pawn there, so we have to, I don't know, I guess, defend it. And black's king is able to kind of infiltrate and put pressure on our pawns, and we're stuck here, right? We can't do anything. The rook can just stay here. We can't do anything. And again, black's king comes in, and Stockfish just says it's dead equal, right? And I think we actually have to be careful here that we don't actually lose this. Like if the rook is able to come and take this, if we were to run our king over here, we could actually lose. So the point is this rook is worth a pawn, right? So even if you're down a pawn, let me flip the board for a second. Even if you're down a pawn, if you're able to get your rook on the 2nd or the 7th rank like this, cut off your opponent's king at the end of the game, that's really good. And don't underestimate how strong that can be, basically. Right, and number 15 is rooks belong behind passed pawns. So in this position, this is a passed pawn for white, and you can see white has the rook behind it. This is the ideal location for the rook because it's going to support the pawn all the way up until the queening square, and that's generally what you want. And even if white's rook wasn't here, like let's say white did something like this, this is going to be a good place for black's rook as well, because it's going to be putting pressure on that pawn the whole way as it tries to go up the board, and that's going to be your best chance to, first of all, stop it from getting a queen. Also, if the king tries to get involved, because you're way back here behind, you have the option to keep, putting the king in check, or force it to walk in front of the pawn, and then it can block the pawn. And there's a lot of more advanced, tricky things that can happen in these rook endings. But generally speaking, just remember, if you can get your rook behind the passed pawn, that's probably where it should go. All right, guys, there's 15 rules for the endgame. I hope you learned something from this video. Let me know if you enjoy this type of endgame video and you'd like to see some more of the studies and things that are in this book. Like I said, it's really, really old, but I think there's a lot of good information in there. So I'd be open to going through some more of the interesting endgame positions if that's something that you guys are interested in. Yeah, thanks for watching. And as always, stay sharp, play smart, and take care.